What's up everybody, this is Josh. Welcome back to another video. Now, a lot of you enjoyed the Splight video that I did last week. If you haven't seen it yet, please check it out. So I asked you guys if you wanted to see the same for Tearalaments, which is the second very impactful archetype coming out in Power of the Elements very soon actually. 2.5 weeks I think from now on is when we get that. And so I decided to make that video now. And let's hop on over. We're gonna jump right into Tearalaments. Now, one thing that is worth noting is that this deck gets significantly stronger in a couple months from now after Power of the Elements because they get very big support in the Ishizu cards. Some of you have probably heard about it, but let's not worry too much about that yet because we're gonna have a couple months with this deck before those cards come out. And the deck is still very good before those cards come out. It's definitely a contender for the meta, I think. So we're gonna look at the basics of the deck, what it does. We're going to look at one very basic replay, but it's not as simple to provide like cookie cutter combos for this deck because it does play with milling and like a lot of randomness involved. You're trying to control the randomness by just having a lot of good mills in your deck, of course, but because of that, it's very hard to show off like standard combos. I still put one together that is like relatively simple. I'm going to provide you with some deck lists to start off with for different variations of the deck because there are a lot of different variants of Tearalaments. And then something that a lot of you asked me about in the last one is actually what can you side against that deck. That was missing in my Splight guide, and so I've included that in this one. So without further ado, let's hop into the basics. There are 4 relevant Tearlament main deck monsters. Those are actually all the Tearlaments out there so far, even in the OCG. I don't think they have any more. And they all have 2 effects. One effect when they're summoned or like on the field or some even in hand, and 1 graveyard effect. Now, the graveyard effect for 3 of them, which is all of them except for Rhinoheart, all the other 3 have the same graveyard effect, which is when they're sent to the graveyard by a card effect, well, rather if they don't miss timing, you fusion summon a fusion monster from your extra deck by placing the fusion material mentioned on it from your hand, field, and graveyard on the bottom of the deck in any order, including the card sent to the graveyard. So yes, this is another fusion archetype, and it's another fusion archetype that does not come with a fusion spell, actually. You only fuse with these effects. So 3 of them have that secondary effect where if they're sent to the graveyard, you can fusion summon, so that basically lets you fusion summon 3 times a turn if you actually manage to get all of them to the graveyard. And then Reinhardt's graveyard effect is when he's sent to the graveyard, you special summon it, and then you have to send the Tearlament card from your hand to the graveyard, which helps you trigger the Tearlaments you have in your hand, right? Because you send them to the graveyard by a card effect, not for cost. Rhinoheart is also your best normal summon, because if this card's normal or special summon, you send the Tearlaments monster from deck to graveyard, which allows you to trigger any of the other Tearlaments, which is really nice. Now, let's go over the first effects of the other ones. Those are mainly used for fusion summoning, but you definitely also use their other effects. Myra is the worst one because all it does is if it's normal or special summoned, you send the top 3 cards of the deck to your graveyard. It's like you'd rather normal summon a Rhinoheart, but sometimes, you gotta resort back to this one. But yeah, if you get lucky with this and you do run a significant amount of good mills, so like sometimes it's just fine. And then we got Shaylin, which is also one of the arguably even as good as Rhinoheart almost, which is during the main phase you special summon it from hand, and if you do, send 1 monster from your hand to the graveyard, and then you also send the top 3 cards of your deck to the graveyard. So this card does a lot of things for this deck. It's a level 4 extender, which we'll get into that later, what you do with that. Secondly, it also triggers Tearlaments you have in hand because you send them to the graveyard. And then third, you also get a bonus 3 mil, which is very good in this deck. And I'm gonna say this right now, this card, I've only seen it in Tearlament decks so far over in the OCG, but this is a good card in general. Like some decks might want to play this just as a level 4 extender that also mills 3 if you have a bunch of grave effects. It's dark, it's got very good stats, attribute, level, and stuff like that. So you might see this in other decks in the future, but yeah. And then we got Venus, however you say that. Also very interesting card because it says when your opponent activates a monster effect on the field, and this is a quick effect, you can special summon this card from your hand, and if you do, send the top 3 cards of your deck to the graveyard. So you already see these come with a significant amount of milling, and this is to an extent a hand trap because if you do hit a Tearlament with this, like one of the other 8, when you have one of this in hand and like you have 8 other fusion summoning Tearlaments left in the deck, if you hit any of those, you can go into some disruptions with this on the opponent's first turn. So it comes with a little bit of at least a possibility of being a hand trap, right? And then we got the field spell, which is Pel Rhino, which is very, very strong. It's not a Tearlament card, which means it's not searchable by some of the cards that search Tearlament cards, but it's still very powerful. When this card is activated, you add a Tearlament from your hand to your deck. You can also add Visa, Starfrost, but you're not going to play that card. Fusion monsters and Tearlaments gain 500 attack, which is also solid, but then the most important part, or like the searching is already pretty important, but also very important, If a Tearalaments monster is returned from field or graveyard to the deck or extra deck, except during the damage step, you target a card on the field and destroy it, which is very, very good. Obviously, all the fusion effects, like I said before, they fusion summon by returning the materials to the deck. So you get the pop every single time you fusion summon, of course once per turn. But I'll tell you right now, this deck has plenty of ways to fusion summon on the opponent's turn, so you can actually use that as a disruption as well if you draw the field spell. It's very powerful. But that's not it. We also got 2 very powerful traps. There's also a third one. I think there's a counter trap. I don't even know what it does. I don't even know if it's in Power of the Elements. I haven't seen it in a single deck list. I read it once, I don't think it's relevant. The only ones you gotta be worried about are these 2. Tearalaments Meta Noise is basically Sinister Shadow Game on crack. If you control a Tearlament monster or Visa Starfrost, target a face-up monster your opponent controls, change it to face-down defense position. Then send 1 Tearlaments monster from your deck to the graveyard. Very, very good, because like I said, those trigger on your opponent's turn to perform fusion summons, to trigger the field spell, to bring out fusion monsters with disruptive effects. It's very powerful, and you get a Book of Moon on top, and this card is searchable in the archetype. But that is not all. If this card is sent to the graveyard by a card effect, you can target a Tearlament monster in your graveyard and add it to your hand. So this is also just a good mill. If you hit it with any of those and you have a Tearlament in your grave you want to grab back, you can do that. The secondary trap, not as powerful but still good. If you control a Tearlament or Visa Starfrost, you target an effect monster your opponent controls, negate its effects, then send 1 monster you control to the graveyard. Now the secondary part of sending a monster you control to the graveyard actually is a benefit in this deck, because if you happen to have any Tearlament left over on the board, you can send it to the graveyard and then perform a fusion summon on the opponent's turn once again. And it's an effect negation. If this card is sent to the graveyard by a card effect, once again you can mill this card. You can add a Tearlament from your deck to your hand, which is also very good. Usually in like basic Tearlament decks that play the full engine, you'll see something like 2 Meta Noise because it is searchable, and you want to have a second one in case you mill the first one, because this card is very, very good, of course. I don't think there's a way to recur it from graveyard in the archetype, so you definitely run 2 in the heavier Tearlament versions, because you want to make sure you have 1 left after you mill 1, and then you play 1 of this simply because it's not as important as this one, because the disruptive effect on this one is just much more powerful. But you know, fusion archetype is nothing without its fusions, so let's look at the fusions. There are 2 fusions in Tearalaments right now. They get more after Power of the Elements, but in Power of the Elements we only get these 2, which is Tearalaments Kid Kalos is the better one, I would say. It's the more basic one, the one that you definitely summon first most of the time. It requires a Tearlament monster and 1 Aqua monster, so right off the bat, any 2 Tearlaments, except for 2 Rhino Hearts, make this. But like, if you're triggering a Tearlament out of these 3, you always have the Aqua, so any other Tearlament will do this. And if it's special summoned, you take a Tearlament card from your deck and either add it to hand or send it to the graveyard. You can target 1 monster you control, special summon a Tearlament monster from your hand or graveyard. If you do, send the targeted monster to the graveyard. If this card is sent to the graveyard by a card effect, you can send the top 5 cards of your deck to the graveyard. You can only use each effect once per turn. Now, this does a lot of good things for this deck. It's a searcher for any Tearlament card. If you are like pretty much happy with all the stuff you got, you can search a trap card. If you need extenders, you can search other Tearlament monsters. Very good. And then the secondary effect comes up a decent amount, where you target a monster you control and then you basically swap it for a Tearlament from the grave or hand. It can target itself, and if it's sent to the graveyard, you mill another 5, right? So something that I did a couple times in my first day of playing the deck, which I don't know if that was always the optimal route, but something you can definitely do, is just send itself and mill 5. Very cool. Secondary fusion, Kaleido Heart. Cannot use fusion material period. If this card is special summoned or an Aqua monster is sent to your graveyard by a card effect while this card is on the field, you target a card your opponent controls, shuffle it into the deck. Very powerful when summoned on the opponent's turn. Very good to clear boards, even on your turn. And then it's got another effect, which if this card is sent to the graveyard by a card effect, you can special summon this card, and if you do, send the Tearlament card from your deck to the graveyard. It comes back. It will trigger again if you haven't used that before, because obviously those effects are once per turn. But like, if this card is sent to the graveyard, it comes back and it foolishes a Tearlament to perform another fusion summon, which is very, very good. That's all the Tearlament cards you're gonna have to be familiar with in Power of the Elements, but of course I've included a couple cards you will very often see them paired with, or pretty much always. These are not limited to summoning Tearlament fusions, so some very obvious ones that you're going to see are Dragostapelia, because once you have one fusion in one field or graveyard, you can turn it into a Dragostapelia alongside any of these, because they're all darks, which is a very good negation. Usually you see at least 2 of those in the decks. They run Mud Dragon of the Swamp, because it's very easy to summon. It's a level 4 water, which Rhino Heart is also water, so you can summon Bahamut Shark into Toad. We like to see that, of course. We can also make Redoer, which Redoer is a very cute thing in this deck. Everyone runs this in the OCG, and I've been making it a lot when testing the deck. The cool thing about this is that Redoer does not detach as a fact, as cost. I mean, it detaches as a fact, which means that if you make it with Shaylin, you can trigger a fusion summon on the opponent's turn, which is really the bread and butter of the deck, trying to set up boards that fusion summon on the opponent's turn to create powerful disruptions. And then of course you have the chance of like hitting spells and traps of the opponent's deck, which is sometimes very crucial, right? You get a free draw, or you get a free putting a card back on top of the deck, really nice. Then something that is very common is you'll see some Shaddolls being splashed into them simply because they are good mills. They are good discards for some of the cards you play. For example, Shaylin requires you to send the monster from your hand to the graveyard. It would trigger the Shaddolls. And once you have a Shaddoll in hand or graveyard, you can summon Winda with any of these, which is very, very powerful. Of course, we all know how good Winda is. So that's something you're gonna see a lot. And then down here, often you'll see Rhoda. It's not mandatory, but it does search Rhino Heart, which is a very good normal summon. You'll always see Instant Fusion, because this triggers when summoned by Instant Fusion. It's so good to draw Instant Fusion in this deck. You'll almost always see Terraforming for this card. Foolish Buried Goods is okay. It was just worth mentioning. I don't see it being played a lot, but it is worth noting that it can turn into any Tearlament by sending this, or it can recover a Tearlament by sending this. It is worth noting. You don't see it a lot though. Foolish is good because it can turn into any Tearlaments. Something a little cute that not every list plays, but you can, I've seen it before, is King of the Swamp and Polymerization. Now, King of the Swamp, OG card, never been good before, but actually becomes viable now. Can be used as a substitute for any fusion material that's listed on a card, and you can discard it to add a Polymerization. Now, of course, you play Poly then, which in that case, you actually do go into some of your fusions just with Poly. But the cool thing about this thing is Aqua, so it basically enables any of your fusions in the extra deck. It can also substitute for the Rhino Heart required for the Kaleido Heart, but it can also make cute things happen. Like you can play Kaliga because you substitute for an Alistair and you have a dark in these. You can make Millenniumize Restrict to play around hand traps, which sometimes you want that in your deck anyways for instant fusion, right? But you can do that and just make that because you substitute for Relinquished. And by including Poly in your deck, you actually get access to Guardian Chimera. You might even want to play that card then, because normally you can't, because this is only from, you need material from hand and field only, because these require you to be included in the fusion summon when they're sent to the graveyard. These cannot make Guardian Chimera, at least, you know. At least they can't summon Guardian Chimera on the opponent's turn. Okay, so that was a lot to talk about. You might be in for a little longer video, but I think that's fine. There's just a lot to talk about in Tearalaments. This deck is, the archetype's very fun, I think, and very, very strong, even though the milling is not for everyone, right? So I struggled to find just one cookie cutter replay. I think you just have to pick a version and start playing with it. The turns are very long, very complicated. Sometimes you're triggering a lot of effects, milling a lot of randomness involved. But I figured I would show you just like a random, just a one card combo, which you're almost never gonna just see this unless your hand is just like this and 4 hand traps. But like, I'm going to show you what you can do in theory with just one Rhino Heart, which is you can summon Rhino Heart, you send any of the other ones. In this case, it doesn't really matter. I sent this one. You trigger the effect to fusion summon, and you fusion summon Kid Kalos. Kid Kalos is going to add you, in this case, because you have no other cards, you're just going to add Meta Noise. You're going to set the Meta Noise and pass, which normally you already know. If you have anything else to extend on this, like mill first, you're going to use fusion material from the grave only. You get to keep the Rhino Heart on the board as a level 4. You can extend with Shaylin, make rank 4s, whatever. But in this case, you're going to just end on Meta Noise. But even this is already pretty powerful, because you can, on the opponent's turn, you're going to flip Meta Noise. You're going to flip a monster face down, which is a powerful interruption nowadays in Yu-Gi-Oh! And you're going to send anything that fuses again. And then you can use that effect to fusion summon into a Dragostapelia. So even just off of this one Rhino Heart, you've gotten the book and the negate, which is pretty solid. And you can do different things with this, but like just to show that even just the one Rhino Heart can go a long way without any other cards being involved. But most of the time, you're gonna have extensive combos when playing this deck. Now, when it comes to deck lists as this, I'm gonna provide you with one that I built, but before that, I wanna get some inspiration from what they did in the OCG. Actually, let's look at the other one first. We're gonna look at this branded Tearlament first, which is something they played a lot. Now, you'll see this with a very small Tearlament engine. I'm not in love with this deck, but it is worth noting that fusion deployment is very powerful in this because it can summon Rhinoheart because it's specifically listed on the Kaleido Heart. The deck matches very well with the branded engine, right, which goes to show in this version of the deck, which they played a little bit in the OCG. Something that's also very good is the Dangers have good synergy with it because Nessie is an Aqua monster, so in the grave you can fuse with it. Mothman is a level 4, which helps you make your Redoer or even Baguska in this list. And just discarding Tearlaments or Shadows is just very powerful, but this one is very cookie cutter, right? It's got some Dangers to facilitate discarding, it's got some Shadows, it's got the Tearlaments almost maxed out. It plays the Supreme Seamare, which is kind of a pseudo Kaleido Heart because on normal summon it gets to Foolish, right? An Aqua monster. And then you pair it with hand traps and all the good stuff, right? So that's just the basic idea from what they did in the OCG before they got the Ishizu cards. Now in the TCG, because we don't have Max C, I think it's a very cool idea to pair this deck with the punks, right? Like Grave Effects just screams, you know, let me teleport for a mill 5, and that's what I've been playing around with. This deck is a lot of fun. The turns go like 10 minutes. Like I don't think I've been playing it optimally yet, but it's a fun challenge to actually try this deck out. You basically play the full Tearlament package and you pair it with the punk engine, throw in a Fairy Tail Snow because you mill so much, right? And you throw in the 2 Shadows because if you hit any of the Shadows, you just get a pretty much free window. I've included some of the options that I haven't included in the deck right now in the side deck, just in case you want to play around with it. The only downside, the only thing I had in mind that I don't really love about this deck when I was testing it is that it doesn't have as much room for non-engine, right? As you can see, I have no room for hand traps, and because I only had room for 6 non-engine, I decided to play Dark Rulers and Droplet in this. It's definitely on the weaker side when it comes to going second, because if you don't draw Dark Ruler or Droplet, you're pretty much going to be at mercy of your opponent not doing anything super unfair, which, you know, we all know how that goes sometimes in Yu-Gi-Oh! Nowadays. But the deck is very fun. I encourage you to try it out. I encourage you to definitely build around the engine with different ideas, right? Because there's a lot of things you can do with this deck for sure. There's a lot of possibilities basically. The OCG played very tame versions of it because of Maxi, I feel like. And we can just go pretty crazy. There's a lot of cool things you can do with Dangers, with punks, and this is definitely a good starting point. I think it performs well on my streams. Let's get to the last part where I show you guys a couple cards that are good against Tearlaments, because that's something you guys were missing in my Splight video. Now, very obviously, Shifter is good, right? Shifter is very good against this deck. It pretty much beats this deck completely. Not every deck can play Shifter, but if your deck can't play Shifter and you're worried about Tearlaments, Shifter is very strong. Card's also all right against Splight because it prevents Ronin Toad and shenanigans. Crow, very strong, because all of the Tearlaments in grave require to be part of the fusion summon, right? They need to be part of the fusion materials to be successful, to resolve successfully, and Crow prevents that. So if at any point your opponent sends a Tearlament to the graveyard and wants to fuse with it and you want to prevent it, you can Crow. You can also prevent it with Bell and Skullmeister. However, these can be chain blocked. That's the only thing worth noting. That's the only thing that makes Crow better than those. I don't think there's anything where these two are actually better unless you want to prevent like a Shaddoll Beast. Usually you don't want to do that. If you already play Crow and you want more copies, you can technically play these two. They are all right. They are also good against that deck. Now, when it comes to cards that are pretty much exclusively side deckable, because these cards are technically main deckable, right? Nibiru next format, probably a side deck card, right? Because it's pretty bad against Splight. But depending on how wild they get with their turn 1s and Tearlaments, Nibiru can actually hit the deck pretty hard unless they summon a Winda very early on, which is always going to be a gamble, because I do expect a lot of them are going to have the Shaddoll cards in there, just like 2 or 3 copies. If they get to them early and they summon a Winda, you might not be able to Nibiru them, but yeah. It's still a good card if they go a little too crazy, like the Punk deck definitely plays into Nibiru a fair amount. It's a fusion archetype, so definitely we want the barrier or non-fusion area to be at least on the list of potential side deck cards. Now, this deck is not branded, that locks itself into only fusions, right? And therefore doesn't have any other options once you prevent that. So it can play, right? You can potentially play like a Phoenix, and you can get to that sometimes against something like non-fusion area. D-barrier is something you can actually circumvent by just fusion summoning on the opponent's turn, right? Like if you D-barrier them and they pass with like a set meta noise or something, they can still play on your turn and potentially set up some stuff. So both of those aren't as powerful as they are against Despia, but it is a fusion deck, so both of those are technically reasonable. One card to mention also comes out in Power of the Elements. Probably not a surprise to you if you already know the card, but it's pretty good against pretty much any deck right now that summons from the extra deck, but it's specifically good against this one, I feel like. Because it's Ultimate Slay. Send one monster from your extra deck to the graveyard, target one monster your opponent controls with the same card type, like Fusion, Synchro, Explosive, Pendulum, or Link. Shuffle it into the deck. Your opponent cannot activate monster effects in response to this effect. This card is very powerful in general, right, if you have the right targets in your extra deck, but specifically against fusion decks, there is a very good target to break boards in Entis. You shuffle a fusion away by sending Entis, and then you destroy a card on the field with Entis. The secondary reason why this is very powerful specifically against this deck is because it summons Winda, and this circumvents the non-destruction clause on Winda, right, because it shuffles into the deck. So if your deck struggles with Winda and you want to have a very powerful side deck card against Tearalaments, this card is definitely the way to go, because any fusion they summon, you can just clear and then pop another card for a free +1. Card is not even once per turn. Very powerful card. And then also, definitely worth mentioning, Abyss Dweller. Any deck that can summon Abyss Dweller going forward, which includes Tearlament actually, they can summon Dweller themselves for the mirror match. Dweller completely shuts down the deck. You're just not going to play under Dweller if the opponent makes it, which is why the droplets are also in the main deck. That's it. I think that should give you a rough overview if you've already looked at the deck. If you already looked at Tearlaments before and I missed anything, feel free to drop it in the comments down below. I'm always down for feedback with these types of videos since I just started making these introductions with Power of the Elements. Is there anything else you want to see from Splight, from Tearalaments? Let me know down below. Other than that, the link to my Twitch stream is going to be in the description down below, where I played these decks already on stream. So if you want to see some early Power of the Element gameplay, then check my stream out. I'll be live again this weekend actually with some coverage of the NAWCQ, and then next week back to the regular streaming schedule. Other than that, I hope you enjoyed the video. I hope you found it helpful. If you did, feel free to leave a like and a comment and subscribe to the channel. And that's it. I'm out. Bye bye everybody. Have a great day.